So in week 6, in chapters 17 and 18, we're going to go back to determining the cost of our product. You'll remember in the first quad, we spent a chapter on job costing, which was where a company typically engaged in delivering a product that was unique to a customer and oftentimes even for service. And so we allocated or accumulated the costs of that job according to a method called job costing. At that time, we introduced a concept called process costing, which is typically used in a manufacturing environment and is typically used when you're producing multiple amounts of similar type products. And we basically just introduced it as a contrast to job costing at the time. Now what we're going to do is walk through how process costing works. And that's what chapter 17 primarily focuses on. Then chapter 18 brings into both process and job costing the issue of what happens when you have spoilage or you have to rework a product for a customer. And so we'll walk through that as well. So in this first example, we're going to walk through a very basic process costing example. Now, before we do that, I want to introduce a concept called equivalent units. Some of you may in the past or at some point have worked for a company wherein you were identified as X amount of full-time equivalent employees. Equivalent units is a similar type concept. So the FTE, full-time equivalents, is how many full-time equivalent positions do you have? Do you have 10 people working full-time? Do you have 20 people working half-time? In either case, you have 10 full-time equivalent employees. Equivalent units does the same thing. What equivalent units does is it says, how many units did you produce? Did you produce 10,000 units during the month? In that case, did you produce them to completion, 100%? In which case you have 10,000 equivalent units. But again, what if you only completed half of those, so that you had 10,000 units, but they were only 50% complete? Now, you no longer have 10,000 equivalent units, you have 5,000 equivalent units. And if you take the cost you incur and divide them by all 10,000 units, you're going to come up with an understated cost per unit, because in reality, there's more work to be done and therefore more costs to incur on these units. And so this concept of equivalent units looks at how many units have you worked on, and what point of completion are you? If you are 100% complete, then your physical units and your equivalent units will be the same. If you're only 50% complete, then your physical units may be 10,000, but your equivalent units will be 5,000. So keep that concept in mind as we walk through these first 2 or 3 examples. So in this first example, we are looking at the month of October, and what we have determined is that work in process at the beginning of October has 4,000 units in it. That means that we ended September with 4,000 units partially completed. Those are coming forward to October, and we will finish them presumably in October. We have incurred direct materials to the tune of $1,248,000 and conversion costs of $241,650. You may remember from last quad, conversion costs include both direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. In other words, those costs that are necessary in order to convert the direct materials into the final product. We are going to treat them as one lump sum under the assumption that they're added similarly throughout the process. Okay, so beginning WIP, 4,000 units, 1,248,000 in direct materials, 241,650 in conversion costs. During the month of October, we started an additional 22,500 units of product. During the month of October, we completed 26,000 units. And what that means is that we ended October with 500 units that were unfinished, that will have to go forward to November to complete. Then another piece of data I'm giving you are the costs that were added during October. We added 4,635,000 in materials and 2,575,125 in conversion costs. Now, what we need to know in order to be able to calculate equivalent units is where we are in terms of completion. Well, what we're assuming with direct materials is that they are all added at the beginning of the process. So for both beginning WIP and ending WIP, we are 100% complete with direct materials. For conversion costs, we are assuming beginning WIP, we are 45% complete, but ending WIP, we are 65% complete. And then we don't necessarily need it for this problem because in this example, I'm assuming zero spoilage. But for future, we're going to assume that any spoilage or defects are discovered at the end of the process. So there is no middle of the road quality control review that would detect them. Okay, so here's our goal. Our goal is to take all of these costs and determine how much in cost is associated with the 26,000 units that we completed and how much is associated with the 500 units that are still in work in process. So it's kind of a three-step process. Here's the first step, which is to determine equivalent units. So we know in terms of physical units, we started October with 4,000. We know we started an additional 22,500, which means at some point during the month of October, we worked on 26,500 units. That means that's how many units we need to account for. We also know that 26,000 units were completed. There were 500 in ending WIP, and that leaves us with our 26,500. Again, no spoilage here. Every unit was either a good unit that we completed or it's sitting in WIP to be completed the next year or next month in this case. So what we basically need to do is we need to calculate the number of equivalent units associated with the good units and ending WIP. Now, good units completed is really a piece of cake. They're 100% complete, which means that our equivalent units is equal to the physical units for both materials and for conversion costs. Again, they're 100% complete. Equivalent units and physical are the same. Ending WIP is another story. Those units are not complete. Now, we know that they are 100% complete as to materials because we're adding materials at the beginning of the process. So physical units as it relates to materials and equivalent units are the same. However, they are only 65% complete as it relates to conversion costs. So equivalent units for conversion costs are 325 or 65% of 500. So what we're effectively saying there is the work that we've done on these 500 units is equivalent to the work we would have done if we had totally finished 325 units. That means that our equivalent units for materials and conversion costs are actually separate. That's not unusual if the costs are incurred at a different time. So for materials, our equivalent units are 26,500. For conversion costs, they are 26,325. So that's the first step. We've determined what our equivalent units were. The second step is to calculate cost per equivalent unit. So we're going to accumulate all of our costs. We have beginning WIP, which just comes from the costs above that I gave us. And then we have the costs that were added during the year, which also comes from above, which means in total we have $5,883,000 in materials, $2,816,775 in conversion costs, which gives us a grand total of $8,699,775. To calculate the cost per equivalent unit, all we need to do is to take the material costs of 5 million and change and divide it by the materials equivalent units of 26,500. That gives us $222 per equivalent unit. Then we're going to do exactly the same thing for conversion costs, and we get $107 per equivalent unit. Now we are in a position to actually assign these costs to the goods that were completed and the goods that are still in work in process. So, good units completed for materials, all we need to do is to take that $222 cost per equivalent unit and multiply it by the 26,000 good units completed. And that gives us $5,772,000 in materials. Then we'll do the same thing for conversion costs. We'll take the 107 times the 26,000 good units completed, equivalent units, and that gives us $2,782,000, which means of that $8,699,775 in costs, we're going to allocate $8,554,000 to the units that we are transferring out of WIP. By the same token, we will take the $222 cost per equivalent unit, multiply it by the 500 equivalent units for ending WIP for materials, and that gives us $111,000. Then we'll do exactly the same thing, multiplying by the 107 by the 325 equivalent units for conversion costs. That gives us the $34,775, and so we have $145,775 that is allocated to WIP. It will remain in WIP moving forward to November. And our check figure here is that the sum of the costs we're transferring out and ending WIP equals the amount of costs that we had incurred. Okay, those two numbers have to equal, because otherwise it implies that you've got costs that you have not assigned to either WIP or completed and transferred out. I have a couple of other comments to make about this example, but I will make them in the next video. So in the next video, I'll close this out and move on into example 2.